So if you go back to 165 AD, there was this absolutely catastrophic plague that just slammed into the Roman Empire.
Yeah, the Antonine Plague.
Right, the
Yeah.
Antonine Plague. And historians today, they mostly think it was likely smallpox. And it struck with just this devastating force. I mean, at its peak, it was killing something like thousands of people a single day, just in the city of Rome alone.
Which is just, I mean, it's hard to even wrap your mind around that level of death.
It really is. And the societal response to this, well, it was exactly what you might expect in an era before, modern medicine or germ theory. Just complete sheer panic.
Oh, absolutely. Total societal collapse.
Yeah. The established government just fled. The wealthy elites, they literally jumped in their carriages and completely abandoned the cities. I mean, even Galen, the most famous physician of the ancient world, he packed his bags and bolted for his country estate just to wait it out.
Right. The guy who was supposed to be the medical expert just runs away.
Exactly. And it gets worse. People were literally throwing their own sick family members out into the streets, sometimes before they were even dead, just, desperately trying to avoid the infection.
Because they had no idea how it spread. They just knew it was a death sentence.
Right. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, in the middle of this absolute, utter collapse of the social order, there was one deeply marginalized, widely despised group of people who did something completely inexplicable.
They ran toward the infection.
Yes, they ran right toward it. They stayed in the cities, they set up what were essentially these frontline triage units, and they began nursing, not just their own families, but their pagan neighbors who had been completely abandoned.
It really is one of the most stunning sociological anomalies in all of human history. I mean, they were willingly exposing themselves to a very gruesome death and doing it entirely voluntarily.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you're joining us because today we are looking at a really fascinating stack of source material that argues this single bizarre historical anomaly, this moment of running toward the plague, is actually the foundational blueprint for why you and I possess things like universal human rights today.
It's a bold claim, but the data is just phenomenal.
It is. We are examining two extensive, meticulously researched briefing documents drawn from the AP211 curriculum. These texts cover sociology, social contracts, and the Christian worldview. And they are specifically designed as a masterclass for a very particular audience.
Right, so if you were a pastor, a lay leader, an apologist, or honestly just someone trying to navigate the intellectual waters of our modern culture, this is for you.
Exactly, and it's important to state right up front how these documents operate. Because the AP211 curriculum, it isn't just a dry academic history lesson, it is a tactical briefing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The sources are built to take profound, historically rigorous academic data and then connect it directly to everyday pastoral application.
Because the explicit goal of the curriculum is to shift the reader from a defensive posture, which, let's be honest, is where a lot of modern believers feel totally stuck right now, into a space where they can confidently articulate the historical and sociological necessity of the Christian worldview.
Exactly. We want to move from playing defense to presenting a really confident, beautiful presentation of the gospel.
So, as your guides through this material today, we are going to trace the exact sequential pathway that the curriculum lays out. We are going to start on what they call the street level.
Confronting the raw, aggressive cultural myths that are just, I mean, they're thrown around every day in coffee shops and college dorms.
Right. And then from there, we'll move into the academy to examine the hard sociological and historical data sitting right beneath those arguments. And finally, we will land in the pulpit.
Which is the practical stuff.
Exactly. Unpacking the curriculum's very practical strategies for preaching this material and using it in counseling situations, especially with people who are actively deconstructing their faith.
It's a brilliant structure, really, because it recognizes that just throwing data at people doesn't change a culture.
No, it rarely does.
Right. You have to understand the philosophical root of the cultural myth, dismantle it with historical reality, and then, and this is crucial, you have to know how to walk a struggling person through that reality with deep pastoral care.
So let's just jump right into the deep end. The street level context. If you are in ministry right now, or, if you just happen to have a neighbor who watches a lot of YouTube debates, you know the exact script we're talking about here.
Yeah. The cynical brick wall.
Yes, you encounter this massive brick wall. It's the assertion that religion is essentially just a primitive tribal survival mechanism. And worse than that, that it is the #1 historical cause of war, division, prejudice, and oppression.
Right. It's the popularized religion poisons everything narrative. I mean,
Hmm.
it is arguably the most common rhetorical weapon used against the institutional church today.
You hear it constantly. I mean, the very moment a Christian tries to assert that their worldview offers, a superior framework for human flourishing, the skeptic immediately pulls the ripcord.
They say, well, what about the Crusades?
Exactly. What about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? What about the Salem witch trials?
If we could just evolve past this religious dogma, we would finally eradicate all the tribalism that causes humans to slaughter each other. That's the argument.
Right. The idea that secularism is the only actual path to a peaceful society. And it's a highly effective argument on the street level.
It is because it's fundamentally an emotional argument.
Yes.
It relies on a handful of very specific, highly publicized historical touchpoints that, frankly, the average person simply hasn't critically examined.
Right. When someone throws the Crusades in your face at a coffee shop, your first instinct is usually to either get super defensive or to just awkwardly apologize for the entirety of church history.
Which is exactly what the AP211 documents tell the reader not to do. Instead of wrestling with the emotion of it, the text provides a diagnostic tool.
A way to audit the actual history of human conflict.
Exactly, using hard data. The curriculum points directly to this massive historical undertaking called the Encyclopedia of Wars. It was compiled by historians Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod.
And this is an incredible resource. I mean, it's important to note, Phillips and Axelrod are not writing a religious apologetic here.
No, not at all. They are strictly military historians.
Right. They set out to document and categorize basically every major military conflict across all of recorded human history. We are talking about a massive 3-volume set detailing millennia of bloodshed.
So what happens when you actually run the numbers? Because that street-level myth relies completely on the idea that religion is the primary driver of all this violence.
Right. The myth makes it sound like religion causes, 90% of all wars.
But the math completely collapses the myth. Phillips and Axelrod documented 1,763 major military conflicts in history.
Okay, 1,763 wars.
Right. And out of those 1,763 wars, they could only classify 123 of them as having a primary religious motivation.
Wait, I just want to make sure I heard that right. 123 out of 1,763.
That is correct.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you do the math, that translates to exactly 6.98% of all historical conflicts.
That is just staggering. So we are talking about less than 7% of all wars being religiously motivated.
It really reframes the whole conversation. And the curriculum points out a secondary statistic within that data that is honestly even more vital for the Christian apologist.
Okay, what is that?
If you look at that 6.98% and you subtract the conflicts that were specifically driven by Islamic expansion or Islamic internal conflicts, the percentage of wars in human history that can be directly attributed to Christianity drops to less than 4%.
Less than 4%. Wow. Okay, so if the skeptic says that religion, and, specifically Christianity, is the great engine of human warfare, they are literally ignoring over 96% of the historical record.
Exactly. It's just historically inaccurate.
But, that naturally begs a pretty massive question. If religion isn't causing the vast majority of wars, what on earth is driving the other 1,600 conflicts on Phillips and Axelrod's list?
The overwhelming majority of human warfare is driven by purely secular material factors.
Like what?
We are talking about resource scarcity, territorial expansion, border disputes, national security, ethnic and tribal rivalries, and just the pure, unadulterated pursuit of political power.
So things like the Peloponnesian War or the conquests of Alexander the Great.
Exactly. The Punic Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. I mean, these were not fought over transubstantiation or the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right.
They were fought over land, power, and resources.
Which, honestly, if we are being intellectually honest here, that makes perfect logical sense if you view humanity purely through a secular, materialistic lens.
How so?
Well, I mean, if we are just highly evolved primates, right, and we are competing for limited resources in a closed biological system, then violent territorial expansion isn't a glitch in the system. It's the entire point of the system.
It is a feature of Darwinian survival.
Exactly. It's survival of the fittest playing out on a national scale.
And the sources hammer this point home by dragging the listener right into the 20th century. The curriculum points out this horrific irony.
Yeah, this part of the document was really sobering.
It is, because the most murderous, blood-soaked century in all of recorded human history was not dominated by religious zealots.
No, it wasn't.
It was dominated by explicitly, aggressively atheistic and secular regimes.
You were talking about Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge down in Cambodia.
Yes, these are regimes grounded in explicitly secular ideologies, specifically Marxist-Leninist materialism.
Right, which actively viewed religion as an opiate.
Exactly. They saw it as a disease to be completely eradicated.
Yeah.
And in their pursuit of a purely secular, politically engineered utopia, they murdered tens of millions of their own citizens.
Because, and this goes back to the worldview issue, if the material world is all that exists, right, and your goal is a specific social engineering outcome, then liquidating an entire class of people, like, say, Stalin liquidating the kulaks, it isn't a moral evil to them.
No, it's just removing an obstacle to the machine.
Right. You aren't killing creatures made in the image of God. You are literally just rearranging biological matter to suit the state.
Precisely. And that is the historical reality the AP211 curriculum really wants the apologist to bring to the conversation.
Okay, but let me push back here for a second, because I can hear the skeptic listening to this right now, and they are formulating their counterattack.
Okay, lay it on me.
The skeptic is going to say, fine, the war statistic is overblown. And yes, Stalin was terrible. But you absolutely cannot deny the sheer volume of violent, oppressive, judgmental Christians throughout history.
Right, they pivot back to the hypocrisy.
Exactly, they'll say, the Inquisition was real. The subjugation of indigenous peoples under the banner of the cross was real. Even if they aren't causing global wars today, the worldview itself seems uniquely prone to being weaponized to hurt people.
That is a very sophisticated pushback. And honestly, it is exactly where the conversation usually goes in real life.
So how do the documents tell us to handle that?
This is where the curriculum provides what I think is one of his most brilliant conversational blueprints. It introduces a concept called the standard of violation.
The standard of violation. Okay, walk me through exactly how this works in a live debate or a conversation.
So the text advises the Christian not to deny the atrocities committed by people claiming the name of Christ.
Okay, so you don't defend it.
Never. You own the Inquisition. You own the hypocrisy. But you force the skeptic to look at the actual mechanics of those failures.
What do you mean by mechanics?
When a Christian acts violently, oppressively, or judgmentally, you point out to the skeptic that the Christian is actively violating the direct, explicit commands of their own worldview.
Ah, I see. Because the founder of the religion explicitly said the exact opposite.
Exactly. Jesus commanded his followers to love their enemies, to pray for those who persecute them, to turn the other cheek, and to serve rather than be served.
Right.
So, a violent, oppressive Christian is a walking ontological contradiction to the teachings of Christ. They are not acting out their religion. They are in active rebellion against it.
Okay, I see where this is going. So the standard they're violating is internal to their own faith.
Yes. But now, here is the pivot. The curriculum challenges the apologist to apply that exact same test to a godless secular regime that is committing mass murder, or even just a secular society that is oppressing its weakest members. What standard within their own secular, materialistic worldview are they violating?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating corner to put the skeptic in.
Because if the universe is purely materialistic, if it is literally just atoms and void, and human beings are nothing more than the product of unguided survival of the fittest, then the strong eliminating the weak is not a violation of the rules.
It is the rule.
Exactly. It is nature functioning exactly as it is designed to function. A regime that wipes out its weaker competitors is acting in perfect logical accordance with a purely naturalistic worldview.
Man, if humans are just animals, then a dictator crushing a minority group is basically no different than a pride of lions taking over a territory, right? Like when a new dominant male lion takes over, he kills all the cubs of the previous male.
That's a great example. Yeah.
And you can't call the lions evil, it's just biology applied to the savannah.
Right.
So you can't use words like unjust or wicked for humans either if your worldview doesn't allow for some kind of transcendent, immaterial category of evil.
Which leads to the ultimate question the curriculum wants you to ask the skeptic.
Which is?
Where are you borrowing your outrage from?
Ah, that's good. That's really good.
You cannot borrow the explicitly Christian category of universal inherent human dignity just to judge the failures of the Christian church, while simultaneously claiming that the Christian church is the great enemy of human dignity.
Right. The skeptic is essentially sitting on a branch of the Christian tree, using Christian morality to saw off the very branch they are sitting on,
Perfectly said.
which I think perfectly sets up our transition into the next major section of the AP211 source documents.
The Academy?
Exactly, because if the street-level myth, this idea that secularism is peaceful and religion is uniquely violent, if that is statistically false, we really have to ask where the myth came from in the first place.
Why does our culture believe it so fiercely?
Right. And the curriculum argues that to defeat the street-level script, you have to go into the academy. You have to understand the academic sociological theories that the average skeptic is unwitting relying on. They don't even know they're relying on them, but they are.
Yeah, and the sources trace this back to the dawn of modern sociology. They specifically point to a foundational figure named Emil Durkheim.
Durkheim.
Right. So in 1912, Durkheim published a highly influential book called The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And in it, he laid out a theory that became known as sociological functionalism.
Functionalism. Okay, I've heard the term in college, but break down exactly how Durkheim defined it. Because the documents suggest this theory is essentially like the invisible software running in the background of the modern secular mind.
It really is. So Durkheim wanted to explain why religion exists in every single human culture. Even though, as a secularist himself, he believed the actual claims of religion, God, spirits, the afterlife, he thought those were entirely false.
So if it's all fake, why does everyone do it?
Exactly. So he studied indigenous tribes, particularly the Arunta tribes down in Australia, and he concluded that religion is essentially just social cement.
Social cement, meaning it exists solely because it provides a practical function for the survival of the tribe.
Right. Durkheim argued that when society worships a god or a totem, they aren't actually interacting with an objective external reality. The god is just a projection. It's a symbol of the community itself.
Okay, wait, explain that a bit more. A symbol of the community.
Yeah, so a tribe takes certain objects or rituals or moral codes, and they collectively designate them as sacred.
Right.
By creating this shared, untouchable sacred space, the society binds itself together. It creates a mechanism to enforce cooperation among its members.
So in Durkheim's view, religion is basically just a tool invented by a culture to keep its social order stable, cohesive, and compliant.
Yeah.
So under the lens of functionalism, religion merely reflects and protects whatever the existing social order happens to be. It's literally just the community validating its own rules and its own power structures.
Exactly. And the AP211 curriculum points out the massive, unavoidable philosophical crisis that occurs when a society fully embraces this functionalist view.
What kind of crisis?
It creates an unbridgeable chasm between personal wholeness and social coherence.
Because of relativism, right? I mean, if Durkheim is right, there is no actual objective truth.
Precisely. Think about the mechanics of it. If there is no transcendent ground for truth, if God is just a functional symbol we made up to keep the tribe from imploding, then all morality is completely relative.
It's just a social contract of convenience.
Right. But if morality is relative and there's no ultimate judge or ultimate meaning, how on earth do you convince individuals to sacrifice their own personal selfish desires for the good of the society?
You can't. I mean, if I know that the sacred rules of society are just a fiction that some guys made up, why shouldn't I cheat on my taxes?
Exactly.
Why shouldn't I exploit my neighbor if I can get away with it? If this life is all there is, my only logical goal is to maximize my own pleasure.
You have completely detached the quest for personal self-fulfillment from the quest for a functional, healthy society.
Which is why the sources point out that secular philosophers, stretching all the way back to Plato in his Republic, have continually been forced to propose what is known as the noble lie.
Yes, the noble lie.
This is one of the most fascinating concepts in the documents. Explain the mechanics of a noble lie for us. Like, how does a society actually try to implement this?
So, because relativism makes objective morality impossible, but society still desperately needs people to act morally in order to survive, these thinkers argue that the intellectual elites basically have to deceive the masses.
They just have to lie to everyone.
Yes, they have to propagate a beneficial fiction, a noble lie. They have to trick the general population into believing that the universe does have intrinsic value, that human life is somehow sacred, and that there is a cosmic reason they should live selflessly for others.
Even though the elites themselves don't believe it.
Right. You pump this lie into the culture, through art, through media, through education, because you know that without it, the society will just fracture into anarchic, tribal self-interest.
But the curriculum provides a pretty devastating critique of this. A noble lie is inherently unworkable, especially today. I mean, you might be able to pull it off in an ancient, isolated city-state where the elites control literally all the information.
Sure, maybe in ancient Athens.
Right. But in an age of the internet, in an age of mass communication and smartphones, the moment the population realizes the foundation of their morality is just a calculated fiction, it entirely loses its power to restrain evil or to inspire sacrifice.
You cannot knowingly build a civilization on a fairy tale and then expect the foundation to hold when a severe crisis hits. People will not die for a social contract they know they just invented.
And this is where the text draws the sharp contrast with the Christian worldview. Christianity, it argues, provides an objective, historical, ontological foundation that achieves that deep social cohesion without requiring deception.
It integrates cosmology,
Well,
the truth of how the universe was actually created by a moral God, with morality, how we ought to live.
Right. It doesn't have to lie to the citizen to get them to serve the state. It simply introduces them to the creator.
But of course, the curriculum anticipates another academic objection right here, the socio-biological argument.
Right, because you don't just hear Durkheim's sociological functionalism today. You hear the modern biological version of it.
Exactly.
You will have a freshman biology student say, look, our moral sense isn't a noble lie, and it certainly isn't given by God. It's just herd morality.
Right. We evolved to cooperate.
Yeah. We evolved to feel empathy and to develop taboos against murder solely because those traits helped our specific primate species survive and pass on our genes. So our values aren't objective, they're just an evolutionary adaptation.
And the skeptic will often add to that. If we rewound the evolutionary film and the environmental pressures were different, wouldn't we just have evolved a completely different set of moral values? Maybe we would have evolved to eat our weak.
So how does the AP211 material instruct the apologist to dismantle that specific argument?
By exposing the absolute limits of the scientific method when it tries to step into the realm of philosophy.
Okay, unpack that.
The text points out that sociology and sociobiology are very, very good at describing the how.
Right, the mechanisms. Yeah.
Yes, they can hypothesize how certain behaviors or tribal bonds or cultural taboos might have developed over millions of years of environmental pressure. But they are entirely fundamentally incapable of explaining why those behaviors are objectively, morally binding on anyone today.
It's the classic philosophical problem. You can't derive an ought from an is.
Exactly. Science can tell you what is happening, but it cannot tell you what ought to happen.
Mm-hmm.
If morality is nothing more than a biological adaptation for survival, then as the sources note, it is reduced to mere habit, custom, feeling, and fashion.
Let's use an analogy to make this really concrete. If human empathy is just a survival mechanism that helped our specific herd survive, how is it morally superior to the survival mechanism of a completely different species, like, say, a wolf pack?
Oh, that's a great direction to take it.
Right, because wolves survive by establishing a brutal dominance hierarchy. If a wolf is injured and becomes a liability to the pack's survival, the other wolves will just turn on it and kill it. That is their herd morality, and honestly, it works perfectly for them.
That is a perfect illustration. If we are just highly evolved animals, on what objective cosmic basis can a secularist claim that the human herd's morality of caring for the weak is genuinely, universally better than the wolf herd's morality of killing the weak?
You can't.
No, you can't. Without a transcendent lawgiver who stands outside of nature and dictates what is good with a capital G, you cannot use words like evil, unjust, or human rights.
Yeah.
You can only say, I personally, biologically prefer this behavior over that behavior.
But personal preference doesn't stop a tyrant.
No, it doesn't. My preference for peace doesn't objectively override his preference for power.
Okay, so this brings us to a massive, glaring historical contradiction that the AP211 curriculum highlights. We have Durkheim's theory. Religion is just social cement, designed to reflect, validate, and protect the existing power structures of a society.
Right.
The sources demand that we test that theory against the actual historical data of the first 3 centuries of the Christian church.
And this is where the sociological data transforms into an incredibly aggressive, powerful apologetic tool.
I love this part.
The text argues that if Durkheim was right, if religion is always just a community worshiping itself to maintain stability, then the early Christian church should have been entirely violently wiped out within a single generation.
Because early Christianity didn't validate the social order of the society it was born into?
Not at all. It was an existential threat to it. I mean, the Roman Empire was built on a very specific deeply entrenched sociology. It relied on a rigid, immovable social hierarchy.
Right.
It relied on institutionalized violence, the absolute unquestioned power of the aristocratic patrician class, and the brutal subjugation of the weak, the poor, and the enslaved.
So if religion's only function is to act as social cement for the dominant culture, Christianity failed spectacularly. It didn't cement Rome. It acted as a solvent. It collided with every foundational value the empire held.
Precisely. And the curriculum leans heavily on the demographic and historical data of sociologists like Rodney Stark, specifically his landmark work, The Rise of Christianity.
What does Stark's data show?
Stark uses historical demographic modeling to show that the early church grew exponentially, roughly 40% per decade for centuries.
40% a decade.
Yes. But they didn't achieve that growth by blending in or by offering a noble lie that supported the emperor. They achieved it by enacting a radical, breathtaking sociological inversion. They didn't replicate Roman structures. They completely shattered them.
The briefing documents outline 3 specific areas where the subversive inversion took place, and we really need to spend some time on these because the historical details are just stunning. Let's start with the first one. The status of women.
Okay.
The curriculum asks us to contrast the Christian view with the Greco-Roman secular norm. What did it actually mean to be a woman in the ancient Roman world?
Well, to understand the Christian disruption, you first have to understand the Roman legal concept of patria potestas.
Which translates to the absolute power of the father.
Yes. In the Greco-Roman world, women possessed incredibly low legal status. They were often forced into early marriages, frequently as young as 12 or 13,
Wow.
and usually to men much older than them, entirely for political or economic alliances. Legally, a woman was treated as a perpetual minor.
So she never really grew up in the eyes of the law.
Exactly. She passed from the absolute authority of her father directly into the absolute authority of her husband.
She had virtually no independent agency.
None. Furthermore, the sources highlight a rampant institutionalized double standard regarding sexual fidelity.
Right.
Men in the Roman world were entirely free, and culturally expected actually, to have extramarital affairs with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines. It was simply the prerogative of power.
But for women,
Women, however, face severe, often lethal punishment for the exact same behavior. The system was designed entirely for the pleasure and convenience of aristocratic men.
so how did the early church, operating right in the middle of this intensely patriarchal culture, invert that sociology?
The Christian community operated on a fundamentally different theology. They treated women as equal co-heirs of grace. The text points to revolutionary concepts found in passages like Ephesians 5.
Right, where husbands are explicitly commanded to love their wives.
Yes, but not just love them self-sacrificially, exactly as Christ loved the church and he gave himself up for her.
Which to a Roman patrician would sound completely insane. You don't sacrifice yourself for your property.
Exactly. And crucially, the church absolutely banned the marital double standard. Chastity and strict fidelity were demanded equally of both men and women.
There was one standard for human sexuality, and it was grounded in the moral nature of God, not in the power dynamics of the Roman elite.
Which provided a level of security, dignity, and autonomy for women that the secular Roman world simply did not offer anywhere else.
It's no wonder Stark's demographic data shows that the early church was disproportionately female. The sociology produced by Christian theology was deeply, tangibly protective of them.
Yes, and it gave them roles of immense influence within the community, as deaconesses, patrons, and martyrs whose stories were told alongside the men.
Okay, the second area of sociological inversion the sources highlight is perhaps the most brutal to our modern sensibilities, but it is so vital to understand: infanticide and exposure.
We really have to strip away our modern Christianized assumptions about human life to understand this part of history.
Yeah, we do.
In the ancient world, devaluing weak or unwanted life was not a crime. It was a standard, universally accepted practice. It ties back again to the patria potestas.
The power of the father.
Right. When a child was born, it was literally placed on the floor at the feet of the Roman father. If he picked it up, it lived. If he walked away, it was discarded.
And the curriculum notes that this was particularly devastating for female infants.
Yes. If a family had an infant that was deformed, sickly, or simply an unwanted female because females required a dowry and were seen as an economic burden rather than an asset, they were routinely subjected to a practice called exposure.
Which means they were literally taken to the city dumps like the Esquiline Hill in Rome or out into the woods and just left there.
Left to die of dehydration in the elements. Or, even more horrifically, the sources point out that these exposed infants were frequently gathered up by opportunists, kept alive, and raised to supply the massive ancient slave and sex trade.
That is just, it's horrifying.
It is, but again, this wasn't considered evil by secular Roman philosophers.
No, the documents mention Seneca, right?
Yes, Seneca, a famous Stoic philosopher,
Mhm.
he actually wrote about drowning weak and abnormal children as simply a matter of reason, separating the useless from the healthy. It was considered a practical necessity for the socio-economic survival of the family and the state.
That is sickening. But again, I have to admit, it is completely logically consistent if your society values power, utility, and survival of the fittest over inherent human dignity. If you are just a drain on resources, you are eliminated.
Right.
So what did the Christians do?
Christians operated on a completely different cosmological foundation. They viewed all human life, regardless of its utility, as sacred from the moment of conception.
Because of the doctrine of the Imago Dei.
Exactly. All humans are made in the image of God. So the early believers didn't just preach against exposure, they actively walked out to those trash heaps, rescued these discarded, diseased, and unwanted infants, and brought them into their own homes.
They raised them as their own sons and daughters.
Yes. They adopted the refuse of the Roman Empire. Now I ask you, apply Durkheim's theory to this. Is that social cement designed to protect Roman values?
No, that is a total treasonous revolution against what the empire believed it meant to be human. It's a complete subversion of the Roman socioeconomic system.
And it deeply unsettled the Roman elites. It challenged the very foundation of their power dynamic, because suddenly this massive, growing subculture was operating on an economy of grace rather than an economy of power.
And that brings us to the third example of this sociological inversion, which circles right back to the hook we started the deep dive with: crisis and healthcare. The plagues.
The curriculum spends significant time on this because the demographic impact was just staggering. We're talking primarily about the Antonine Plague around 165 AD, and later the Cyprian Plague around 251 AD.
These were catastrophic epidemiological events.
Oh, massive. They wiped out huge percentages of the population. Some estimates suggest up to a third of the empire died.
So what was the secular pagan response to these plagues? We touched on it earlier, but the documents go into specific detail about why they reacted the way they did.
The response was absolute self-preservation, and it was completely driven by their worldview. Pagan elites, government officials, physicians, and even the pagan priests of the healing temples fled the infected cities.
The sources quote accounts of people literally throwing their sick family members into the streets to distance themselves from the miasma, the infection.
Right. But you have to ask why. Why would a father abandon a son?
Because the secular and pagan worldview of the time lacked any theology of redemptive suffering.
Exactly. They lacked a coherent, hopeful view of the afterlife. To the pagan, this life was all there was, and the gods were clearly angry. There was absolutely no logical, philosophical reason to risk your one earthly life to comfort someone who is already doomed.
But the Christians stayed.
They stayed. And the curriculum highlights the profound theological engine driving that decision. Driven by a theology of resurrection, the absolute conviction that death was a defeated enemy and not the final word, they organized systemic care.
They nursed not only their fellow believers, but their pagan neighbors who had been abandoned by their own families.
The text notes that they provided basic nursing hydration, food, washing. They weren't performing complex surgeries.
Right, but epidemiologically, just providing basic hydration and care to someone suffering from a disease like smallpox drastically lowers the mortality rate.
Sociologist Rodney Stark points out that while the pagan mortality rate was catastrophic, the Christian communities, because they cared for each other, survived at significantly higher rates.
The analogy I keep coming back to is a frontline triage unit in a modern war zone. Imagine a dirty bomb goes off in a major city. The established government, the police, the wealthy, they all panic, jump in their cars, and flee the blast radius. But this one specific, heavily persecuted minority group, wearing a different uniform, actually turns around and runs toward the radiation zone. They set up field hospitals in the rubble while the empire abandons its own people.
It's a powerful image.
If you are a Roman citizen watching this, if you are the pagan who was thrown into the street by your own brother, only to be scooped up and nursed back to health by a Christian, you can't help but realize this isn't just a new philosophy. This is a supernatural disruption.
It is the ultimate apologetic of love. And it proved to the ancient world that Christianity wasn't a functionalist noble lie. As the curriculum argues, people do not joyfully risk agonizing death by plague for a social contract they know they invented.
No, they don't?
They only do that if they are utterly convinced they are serving a risen king who commands them to love their neighbor and who holds their eternal soul secure.
So, if the historical data is this clear, if the early church changed absolutely everything about how we value human life, women, children, and the sick, we really have to ask the obvious question.
Why does modern secularism claim to have invented all of this?
Yes. The narrative we're always fed in culture today is that human rights, equality, and compassion were, discovered during the 18th century Enlightenment, supposedly only after we threw off the dark, oppressive shackles of religious dogma.
This brings us to a crucial integration point in the Academy section of the AP211 deep dive. The curriculum argues that the claim that secularism invented human rights is not just a slight misunderstanding. It is a severe historical myth.
And the brilliance of the curriculum here is that it doesn't just quote Christian theologians to prove its point.
No, that would be too easy to dismiss.
Right. It introduces profound, undeniable concessions that are currently being made by major secular non-Christian historians and philosophers.
Using secular scholars to validate the Christian worldview's historical impact. That is a brilliant tactical move for an apologist.
Who are the thinkers the source is focusing on here?
The first is Tom Holland. Not the actor who plays Spider-Man, obviously,
Yeah.
but the brilliant British classical historian. Holland identifies as a secular agnostic. He wrote a massive sweeping book a few years ago called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World.
I've heard of that one.
It's fantastic. Holland spent years steeped deeply in the primary texts of ancient Greek and Roman history, translating Herodotus, studying the Spartans and the Caesars. And the text highlights a terrifying realization Holland had during this research. What did he realize? He realized that the ancients were incredibly, unimaginably cruel by our standards, and that they did not think like us at all. He realized that if he lived in Sparta, he wouldn't be writing history. He probably would have been killed as an infant for not being a perfect physical specimen.
Wow.
He concluded that modern concepts of universal human rights, liberalism, and equality are not natural baseline human settings. They are not evolutionary inevitabilities.
The quote the curriculum pulls from Holland is striking. He says, "To sit in a modern Western country and declare that all human beings have equal value is to speak a language that is saturated in Christian theology."
Exactly. Holland points out that to the ancient Greeks and Romans, the concept that a patrician and a slave possessed the exact same inherent cosmic value would be utterly bizarre, deeply offensive, and completely ungrounded in any observed reality.
He admits, as an agnostic, that universal human rights are the direct, exclusive legacy of the cross.
The legacy of the cross.
An agnostic historian looking at the data and admitting that without the specific historical crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, the very concept of a universal human right wouldn't exist in Western civilization today. That is incredibly powerful. Who is the other thinker the AP211 sources bring to the table?
Jürgen Habermas. And this inclusion is even more surprising and effective, honestly. Habermas is widely considered one of Europe's most prominent, highly influential philosophers. He comes out of the Frankfurt School tradition, which means he leans heavily toward Marxism and secularism. Based on his background, you would expect him to be intensely hostile to the idea that Christianity is the foundation of modern good.
But the curriculum shows that he concedes the exact same point.
Completely, and with astonishing clarity. Habermas writes about the origins of egalitarian universalism, which is just the dense academic term for the idea that everyone is equal and deserves the same rights.
Right.
He writes that egalitarian universalism, along with the ideals of freedom, collective life, democracy, and human rights, are the direct heir of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love.
He traces the entire architecture of modern Western democracy straight back to Mount Sinai and the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes. And his concluding thought, the kicker that the curriculum highlights, is just profound. Habermas, the secular Marxist philosopher, looked at the landscape of modern values and admits, to this day, there is no alternative to it.
No alternative to it. Let that sink in. The AP211 material is showing us that the most rigorous secular minds are looking deep into the basement of our society, examining the foundation, and openly admitting, we didn't build this. We inherited it from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and if we lose that tradition, we don't have a backup plan.
It proves the point perfectly. Modern secularism is essentially a freeloader on the moral capital of Christianity. It deeply enjoys sitting in the shade of the tree of human rights, but it is aggressively, actively trying to chop down the theological roots that keep that tree alive.
Which is a perfect segue into the final and perhaps most vital phase of our deep dive.
The pulpit.
Yes, we are transitioning out of the historical data and into the pulpit. We've covered the street-level myths about war and tribalism. We've dove deep into the sociology of Durkheim, the demographic data of the plagues, and the secular concessions of Holland and Habermas.
But the AP211 curriculum demands that we don't just leave this as an intellectual exercise.
Right, what does this all mean for the target audience? If you are a pastor preparing a sermon or a lay leader sitting in a coffee shop counseling a struggling church member, how do you actually apply this dense sociological data?
The sources are incredibly practical here. They present a very common, very painful pastoral scenario to help the reader apply these concepts.
What's the scenario?
The curriculum asks you to imagine a young adult in your congregation. They're sitting across from you, and they're deeply disillusioned. They're looking at the modern institutional church. They see the historical scandals, the moral hypocrisy of high-profile leaders, the intense political polarization, and they have concluded that the church is an inherently oppressive force.
They are ready to entirely deconstruct and abandon their faith.
Yes.
And this is a scenario playing out in almost every church in the West right now. So what is the pastoral strategy the documents recommend? Because I can tell you the immediate fleshly instinct for most apologists or pastors in that moment is to get defensive.
Oh, absolutely. To immediately try to debate them.
Right, to say, well, the media exaggerates it, or those were just a few bad apples, look at all the good we do.
And the briefing document gives a counterintuitive but absolutely vital instruction here. Do not defend the failures.
Don't defend them.
Never minimize historical atrocities or modern church scandals. Do not make excuses for hypocrisy. Instead, the curriculum instructs the pastor to do the exact opposite. Agree with their outrage.
Wait, agree with the person deconstructing, validate their anger at the church.
Yes, because this is the crucial pivot point in the counseling strategy. You agree with their anger, but then you gently point out to them the origin of their standard of outrage.
Oh, okay.
You show them that their deep, visceral, burning conviction that the powerful should not abuse the vulnerable, that hypocrisy is wicked, and that spiritual leaders should serve rather than exploit is actually a profoundly, uniquely Christian standard.
Oh, I see. You show them that they aren't actually using a secular, enlightened standard to judge the failures of the church. They are using Jesus to judge the church.
Precisely. The text points out that they are using Christian morals to critique bad Christian behavior.
That's a huge perspective shift.
It is. Because if this young adult were truly adopting a secular, Darwinian, materialistic worldview, they shouldn't be morally outraged that strong, powerful church leaders are exploiting weak, vulnerable parishioners.
Right, because in a Darwinian world, the strong exploiting the weak is just nature running its course. It's the survival of the fittest.
Exactly. The very fact that they are outraged proves that their heart still implicitly believes in the Christian moral framework.
That is such a compassionate, brilliant pastoral maneuver. You completely validate their pain and their sense of justice while simultaneously challenging the intellectual conclusion they are drawing from it.
You are telling them your sense of justice is right, but you can only keep that sense of justice if you keep Christ.
And the sources offer a highly engaging analogy to help explain this exact concept to a congregation or a youth group, the Beethoven analogy.
Right. The curriculum uses this to help distinguish the message from the messengers.
Walk us through it.
Imagine you go to a prestigious concert hall to hear a symphony by Beethoven, but the orchestra is having a terrible night. They play horribly out of tune, the timing is a mess, the brass section is missing notes, and it sounds totally disjointed and awful.
Okay.
You don't walk out of the concert hall and declare to the world, wow, Beethoven was a terrible composer, his music is awful.
Right. You blame the musicians. You say they aren't playing what is actually written on the page. They are ruining a masterpiece.
Exactly. You demand that the musicians look back at the original sheet music and play it as the composer intended.
That applies perfectly.
In the exact same way, the text argues that when the church acts oppressively, violently, or hypocritically, the answer isn't to throw away the gospel. The answer is to demand that the church look back at the sheet music of Scripture.
The validity and beauty of the philosophy must be judged by its foundational texts and its founder, not by the deeply flawed people who are currently failing to live up to it.
That is a phenomenal homiletical tool. You can build an entire Sunday school lesson around that.
Which brings us to the big overarching idea for preachers that the curriculum distills from all the sociological data. If you are standing in the pulpit, what is the core message you need to deliver to a culture that wants human rights without Christ?
The homiletical hook the text provides is this. Secularism is frantically trying to harvest the beautiful fruits of Christian love, while simultaneously taking an axe to the theological roots that grew them.
Harvesting the fruits while cutting the roots.
Yes, the curriculum challenges the pastor to boldly proclaim that you cannot maintain a society built on human rights without the God who granted humans their dignity.
As a preacher, your job is to show your congregation that the beautiful things our secular culture desires most deeply, justice, equality, compassion, care for the marginalized, are not natural human defaults. They are specific fruits that only grow on the tree of the gospel.
To help teach this practically, the AP211 briefing documents include a very stark, very clear comparison chart.
Oh yeah, the contrast chart.
Right. It contrasts the foundational social architecture of secular humanism right next to the architecture of Christianity. We should really walk through these points because this is an incredible, ready-to-use teaching tool for a discipleship class.
Let's do it. Let's look at the first major category they contrast: authority.
According to the text, under secular humanism, the ultimate unquestionable authority is mankind. But practically speaking, on a societal level, that always inevitably becomes the state.
It is simply whoever holds the most power at the moment.
Exactly. But under Christianity, the ultimate authority is God, revealed through the Bible, which means there's an objective, transcendent moral standard above the state that holds the state accountable.
Which is the only true protection against tyranny. If the state is the highest authority, the state can do whatever it wants. If God is the highest authority, the king is subject to the exact same law as the peasant.
Right. The second category they contrast is human nature. We've touched on this heavily with the plagues and infanticide, but let's reiterate how the curriculum frames it here.
Secular humanism views human nature as simply an animal elevated by chance and time. We are a cosmic accident, a collection of atoms.
Christianity, however, views human nature as uniquely created imago Dei, in the image of God.
The curriculum stresses that this theological point is the sole exclusive foundation for inalienable rights.
Yes, if you are made in God's image, the state cannot legitimately take your dignity away because the state didn't give it to you in the first place. Your rights are endowed by your Creator.
Which brings us to the inevitable question of purpose. If the state is the authority and humans are just an accident, what does the curriculum say happens to a society's actual purpose for existing?
For the secular humanist, the text argues that the highest possible purpose in life is simply to know and please the self.
It devolves into ultimate atomized individualism, maximizing personal pleasure and minimizing personal pain.
But for the Christian, the purpose is fundamentally different: to know and love God and to love others. It is inherently relational, self-sacrificial, and outward-facing.
The fourth category is government. How do these two worldviews practically alter the way a society governs itself?
The sociological outcome of humanism, according to the sources, swings between two extremes. It is either potential anarchy, because if everyone's purpose is to please themselves, everyone simply does what is right in their own eyes.
Right.
Or to prevent that anarchy, it becomes totalitarianism or socialism, where the state must exert absolute coercive control over every aspect of life just to maintain order.
Christianity, by contrast, promotes the concept of freedom under God. Because believers are internally restrained by the Holy Spirit and a transcendent moral law, they require far less external tyrannical control by the government.
A society that polices itself from the inside doesn't need a police state on the outside.
And the final category on the chart, emphasis.
Secularism places its entire cultural emphasis on individual rights. The driving question is always, what am I owed by society?
Christianity places its emphasis on social responsibility. The driving question shifts to, what do I owe my neighbor?
This chart really clarifies the stakes of the cultural conversation. But the AP211 documents issue a very strong warning here.
What's the warning?
The curriculum insists that we must make sure we don't reduce Christianity to just another competing sociological program. We can't just treat it as a better version of Durkheim's social cement.
Oh, I see. We can't just say it's a very useful, noble lie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text makes a vital, non-negotiable theological distinction regarding what it calls the inward cause.
This is perhaps the most crucial point for the pastor or the apologist to remember, and the curriculum is very explicit about it.
Sociology can observe the outward fruit, A secular sociologist can look at history and say, wow, the early church fed the poor, they rescued exposed infants, and they loved their enemies. That is fascinating data.
But sociology cannot explain the inward cause. Human social programming, rules, guilt trips, or a noble lie cannot produce genuine, regenerative, self-sacrificial love.
A noble lie might get you to pay your taxes, but it won't make you walk into a smallpox ward to bathe a dying stranger.
Exactly. The AP211 curriculum argues that only the supernatural regenerative power of the Holy Spirit, actively working in the hearts of broken individuals, can produce that kind of radical, anomalous community.
The curriculum insists that as a pastor, you aren't just calling people to adopt a better, more historically stable sociology, you're calling them to surrender to a resurrected king who actually changes their fundamental nature from the inside out.
So what does this all mean as we wrap up this deep dive into the AP211 source material? Let's synthesize the incredibly dense journey we've been on.
We started on the street, dismantling the emotional myth that religion is the primary cause of war, using the hard, unyielding data of the Encyclopedia of Wars.
We moved into the academy, contrasting the secular theory of functionalism with the undeniable historical reality that the theology of the early church absolutely shattered Roman brutality, protecting women and rescuing the discarded.
We examined the profound concessions of secular historians like Tom Holland and Jürgen Habermas, who admit that the very concepts of human dignity and equality are not secular inventions, but the direct, exclusive legacy of the cross.
And finally, we brought it to the pulpit. The curriculum provided a deeply compassionate strategy for counseling those in deconstruction, the Beethoven analogy to separate the perfection of the gospel from the failures of the church, and a clear, teachable contrast between secular and Christian foundations.
The AP211 documents make one thing abundantly clear. These historical and sociological truths aren't given to us just so we can win arguments on the internet.
No, they are meant to inspire a profound, deep love for Christ, showing that his kingdom truly is, exactly as Jesus said, the salt of the earth. It is the active, essential preservative that keeps society from completely decaying.
It is designed to give the believer deep confidence. The curriculum's ultimate message is that the church does not need to cower in the corner, apologizing for its existence to a secular culture.
Because despite its deeply flawed human messengers, the actual message of the gospel of Jesus Christ has undeniably been the greatest force for human flourishing, equality, and compassion in the history of the world.
As we close, the briefing documents leave the reader with one final, deeply provocative thought, something for you to mull over and explore on your own as you prepare for ministry this week, or as you look out at the shifting cultural landscape.
The text poses this haunting question: if the existence of a functioning, just, and compassionate social order is not just a brute fact of biology, but is instead a massive, undeniable pointer toward a rational, moral creator.
What happens to a society's literal ability to survive when it fully, entirely embraces the secular idea that the universe is just a silent and mindless place where all things are permitted?
If you are enjoying the beauty of the cathedral, but you decide to take a jackhammer to the crypts in the basement.
Exactly. If the theological roots are finally fully severed, how long until the tree dies?
The haunting but absolutely necessary question for our time. Keep exploring the foundation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.